It's a sound you actually feel, folks. Here's another one. 1,425 horsepower. The engine is 1,820 cubic inches and 9 cylinders. Do the math and work it out. The cylinders on that are huge. The sound is because they've basically got individual exhaust stacks on all but the bottom cylinders. Although it looks quite modern, you wouldn't believe it, but the prototype of this first flew in September 1949. It was designed by North American Aviation to actually replace another of the company's products in the US Air Force and the US Navy. That was called the T6 or the SNJ. We know it as the Harvard here in the Commonwealth. It was a much larger aircraft. The early variants were powered by a smaller engine, only about 900 horsepower. And the reason for that was that in those days they were training to fly the early jets. Now the early jets were very heavy, they didn't have responsive engines and not like the jet aircraft that the military operates today. So what they had to do was to have an aircraft that simulated that sort of characteristics. This was a heavy aeroplane and he had the 800 horsepower engine in it, but once the jet technology improved, then they put the bigger engine in. The 1425 horse went in the B model, came out to be operated by the US Navy. There was a second specific US Navy version, and it was used for carrier qualifications, and it was fitted with a tail hook. You could tell the difference between the aircraft in flight, as under the rear fuselage right at the back there was a bit of a notch, and that's where the tail hook sat. Coming back in now, close formation pair. Now these aircraft weren't just used for flying training and carrier qualifications. They also were used for armament training. There was a specific model that was brought out for counter-insurgency, and in those days the term counter-insurgency wasn't really well known. We all know what an insurgent is these days. Now basically the aircraft could be fitted with either 2 or 6 underwing hard points. Now those hard points are where the wing is strengthened, and they could put a pylon on that strengthened section and load it up with bombs or other armament. This could actually carry 2 50 caliber Browning machine guns on one of those mounts. It could also carry napalm, 17 or 19 shot pods that had air-to-ground rockets in them, and also Mark 82 500-pound bombs. So this was a real fighting machine as well. Used by the US Navy, the US Marines, and also the US Coast Guard for training into the early 1980s. And the last training flight with the US Navy was in 1984 with a squadron called VT-27. It's a US Navy designation. V for squadron, T for training, 27. So US Air Force also used these aircraft in Southeast Asia. It's incredible to think that even though that was principally thought of as a jet war, that a lot of piston-engined aircraft that were even throwbacks to World War II operated there. US Special Operations Squadrons operating particularly out of a place called Nakhon Phanom in Thailand. Flew the T-28. They also flew the Douglas Sky Raider, a big single-engine former torpedo bomber designed at the end of World War II and used with great effect as ground attack. And they also flew the twin-engined A-26 Invader up there. Lieutenant Collins just separating there for the solo demonstration. Those of you who are up on the northern ramp can see that huge Grumman Avenger, the Navy torpedo and dive bomber, just starting up. As you can see the folding wings on that machine, designed so that more aircraft could fit on an aircraft carrier. Glenn just bringing the T-28 in. Now this aircraft is marked up as a US Army aircraft, which it was, but it was actually built for the US Navy. It later transferred to the Army, and they both wore the same type of tactical marking and training marking. Was actually allocated to the US Naval Aviation Museum based at Pensacola in Florida, kept in storage and then later declared surplus. So it was sold off to a number of private buyers before it came into the hands of Paul Bennett. Now Paul has put together a stable of aircraft, as you can see, and he's really done an incredible job of bringing aviation back to the regions. 50s and 60s we had a lot of air shows, but they petered out. Paul has brought it back with a vengeance. Now these aircraft, we mentioned the US Air Force using them for counter-insurgency. It is not well known that during the Vietnam War there was also a conflict that took place in Laos, right next door, and it ran for 5 years before anyone knew about it. American pilots were operating in there against the North Vietnamese. Why? The Ho Chi Minh Trail, most people think it just went across the border from North to South Vietnam. It actually filtered through in hundreds of tracks and trails right the way through Laos and then back into South Vietnam. And the Royal Lao Air Force was equipped with the T-28, which they operated with distinction. But there was also another group that was called the Ravens. Now these guys were actually former US Air Force forward air control pilots. Now these guys served an operational tour in Vietnam, and if they were particularly good, literally, if you read the book by Christopher Robbins, they were tapped on the shoulder by a guy wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a Panama hat who would say to them, "Do you want to fly in a real war?" Well, what they were doing was they were being recruited to go into Laos. They go into Thailand, buy one of these aircraft or a Bird Dog or an O2, fly it into Laos, into Vientiane, and then would go to an operational squadron, either up the north to a place called Laotian, or perhaps down south to Pak Se. It's not well known that up north, the hill tribes, which were the Hmong or the Miao, it was Ho Chi Minh's stated objective in 1954 to actually wipe out these hill tribes. And so the hill tribes assisted in their own protection. Up at Long Tien, they had a base there which was secret, but it actually had more flights in and out of there than JFK Airport. Made famous in the movie Air America by Mel Gibson. Now these guys, the Ravens, flew by normal rules very, very little. They were pretty much allowed to operate in the best way they could to achieve the results. The Lao also flew these aircraft, or the Royal Lao Air Force, and one of their national heroes was a former teacher called Lee Lu, and he became a national hero flying these aircraft and precision, pinpoint accuracy, bombing North Vietnamese anti-aircraft positions, convoys, etc. To mention, this aircraft is built by North American Aviation. It's the same company that built the P-51 Mustang fighter in World War II. And believe it or not, this aircraft, designed and manufactured as a trainer, can actually outperform a Mustang up to 10,000 feet. The visibility from the cockpit is incredible, and it has substantial load capable carrying. Napalm, 500-pound bombs, machine guns, and those unguided air-to-ground rockets.
Definitely not being 46.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, up on the northern end of the airfield, you can see that wonderful Grumman Avenger up there. We mentioned earlier on the big torpedo bomber and dive bomber. Just going through its pre-takeoff checks, flown today by Paul Bennett. Paul's going to head off for his display, and then Glenn Collins will bring the T-28 back in. Have a look at this machine. On the ground, it is very, very ungainly, and it earned the nickname the Turkey for that reason. But in the air, it is a brilliant performer. That's a nice sounding motor there.
huge motor. We were listening to the Trojan 9-cylinder, 1500 horsepower, and we bolted another 5 cylinders on that, and another 500 horsepower, and Ando give you the Avenger.
1900 horsepower. It's exactly the same engine as fitted to the North American B-25 Mitchell bomber. The bomber was made quite famous by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle when he flew a squadron of those bombers off the aircraft carrier, American aircraft carrier, which they called the Shangri-La, and went over and bombed Tokyo for the very first time.
Yeah, well, but it's that, even that World War II kind of, they just not building up the speed up the big massive yak,
So on to your left, you will see our Trojan T-28 come in. And boys and girls, mums and dads, what a performance that one was. So from Cloud 9 all the way through to the northern end of the strip, we'd like you to show appreciation as we bring this beautiful warbird down onto the tarmac. So wave your hats and give them a big wave and smile those small and clinic pearls. You're at the Central Coast Airshow.
Look at the size of that machine, Rusty. Can you imagine that Avenger that's coming in now from our left? 2 squadrons of them on a carrier, plus maybe a squadron of Corsair fighters and another one of Hellcats. That is a huge aircraft carrier.
That's one massive bit of steel in the middle of the ocean. And here comes that beautiful Avenger.
Ironically, this aircraft was shown to the public for the first time in the United States on the east coast of America on the 7th of December 1941, the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now that Pearl Harbor attack was a number of hours after that first public display, and it was for that reason, the unprovoked attack, that the aircraft was called the Avenger. It was actually introduced in 1942, and its first operations were at the island battle for Midway. There are only 6 of these at Midway. The aircraft was actually produced by Grumman and the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors. The Grumman ones were known as the TBF. This is a TBM built by General Motors. Now, although there were only 6 aircraft at Midway, they were credited with drawing off the Japanese fighter aircraft that were protecting the carriers and allowing the American dive bombers to hit those carriers. There were massive losses to the Japanese in that battle. They lost the battle and lost many of their main battle aircraft carriers. Soon after that, in August 42, the Battle of the East Solomons, Avengers from the Saratoga and the Enterprise sunk another Japanese carrier. You can see that cavernous bomb bay open there.
They hadn't said anything by 1.
2 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns and 303 machine guns in the ventral position, and also in that turret. There's a single turret there at the very end of the cockpit canopy. Can also carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or a 2,000 pound Mark 13 torpedo.
Basically just go straight in.
1942 was a stellar year for strike back for the Americans, because in November the Marine Corps and Navy Avengers actually sank the battleship PA in Guadalcanal. course, the Avenger went on to operate with numerous air forces and navies. Flew with the Royal New Zealand Air Force, flew also with the Royal Navy. There were 9 different users of the Avenger throughout its life, and about 39 different versions. And the markings worn by this aircraft are for the USS Bunker Hill. Now, carrier air groups, because there were so many of these squadrons, and in a task force there could be up to 7 main carriers and perhaps 5 or 6 secondary carriers, they had to know what ship to land on. So the marking on the wing and the tail of this aircraft, the big broad arrow, signifies the Bunker Hill, and that was the same marking carried on the deck of the carrier. If you look at the massive effort of the US Navy during the Second World War, the number of carriers that were produced and operated principally in the Pacific, at the Bunker Hill, the Essex, the Ticonderoga, all embarked at least 3 squadrons of aircraft. Famous people have been involved with the Avenger. George W. Bush, the former President of the United States, he was the youngest US naval aviator, and he was involved with carrier operations in the Pacific, flying Avengers. His crew attacked Japanese installations at an island called Chichijima, and unfortunately they were shot down. That was a very heavily defended island. He survived, obviously, but the rest of his crew perished. Now, someone else who you would not think in your wildest dreams would be associated with the Avenger is the actor Paul Newman. He was colourblind, so he couldn't fly for the Navy, but he became a turret gunner on Avengers. There were many personalities that flew with the US Army Air Corps and the US Navy during the Second World War. I think there were up to 100 quite famous people. There were just under 10,000 of these Avengers produced, and it is very ironic that the last operational user, military user, was actually the Japanese Self-Defense Force. So the Kiwis used this, number 30 and 31 squadrons, operating in the Solomon Islands. They didn't use it as a torpedo bomber, but a dive bomber, and used it to very great effect. There's currently 1 Avenger flying in New Zealand, painted up in those Kiwi markings, flying from the New Zealand base at Ahakia in the North Island. British Pacific Fleet also operated these aircraft, and the British had a couple of bases here in Australia, one at Nowra and one at what is Bankstown Airport now, called HMS Napoli, and that's where they based quite a lot of their aircraft and stored them for use to call up to the front lines in that Pacific War. Post-war use for a variety of purposes. Principal post-war use was actually as a fire bomber and also to spray fire ants in Georgia. Very difficult aircraft to restore, because one of the things that disappears is the bomb bay doors, and to manufacture those with double curves, compound curvature, and the doors actually split, a very complex process. A wonderful aircraft. This is the only one of its type flying in Australia. There were 3. And Paul Bennett, who was flying this, was actually the chief pilot with the guy who owned these machines.
And of course, like we always ask you, at a Paul Bennett air show, and the man himself brings that big, beautiful Grumman Avenger down. We'd like you to show your appreciation, ladies and gentlemen. Get up out of your chairs, give him a round of applause, make some noise, wave your hats and cans in the air. Look at flames popping out of that beautiful 14-cylinder, 1900 horsepower motor. Keep it going here at Central Coast. You're at one of the best air shows you'll see anywhere on the planet.
That's my favourite plane. I love that plane.
And over your back shoulder, ladies.